You've been told to eat better, move more, cut back on coffee, get your steps in. Most of it sounds reasonable. Some of it you've tried. And yet the fatigue is still there. The weight that arrived in your 50s hasn't moved. The brain fog around 3 in the afternoon arrives on schedule every day. Here's what changes everything. Not what you do occasionally. What you do every single day. Repeated, compounded, accumulated, and either slowly protecting you or slowly taking years off the back end of your life. 4 habits. What the research actually says happens inside your body when you do them, or don't, every day after 50. No guessing, no generalities. The numbers are specific, and some of them will genuinely surprise you. The single most confusing thing about nutrition research isn't that scientists keep changing their minds. It's that the headlines tell you they are, when in reality, what they're doing is something far more useful. Getting more precise. Take eggs. If you've spent the last decade trying to figure out whether eggs are good or bad for you after 50, you're not alone. The answer has whiplashed in public health media so many times that most people have simply given up and decided whatever makes them feel better is probably fine. But the actual research, when you read it carefully rather than through a headline, tells a story that's more specific and more useful than either extreme. A large study out of Northwestern University, tracking dietary cholesterol intake across nearly 30,000 adults, found that consuming the equivalent of 3 to 4 eggs per week was associated with a 6% higher risk of cardiovascular disease and an 8% higher risk of death from any cause. That's the number that made headlines. That's the number that sent a generation of breakfast eaters into a panic. But here's what happened in the research that came after it. A separate study from the American College of Cardiology enrolled 140 adults over the age of 50, people who already had elevated cardiovascular risk factors, and followed what happened when they ate more than 12 fortified eggs per week compared to a control group who ate almost none. The result? No statistically significant change in cholesterol levels or cardiovascular biomarkers between the groups. Not a modest change, no meaningful change. Then came the ASPRI study, one of the largest and longest cohort studies ever conducted specifically in adults over 70, tracking nearly 9,000 participants across Australia and the United States. What ASPRI found was this. People who ate eggs weekly, not daily weekly, had a 29% lower risk of dying from cardiovascular causes and a 17% lower risk of dying from any cause compared to people who rarely or never ate eggs. 3 bodies of research, 3 different answers. And buried inside the ASPRI data, in a detail most summaries skip, is the signal that resolves the contradiction. It wasn't eggs that appeared to carry the mortality signal in the Northwestern study. It was daily egg consumption specifically compared to weekly. A distinction the original headline never made. Frequency, not food. The same ingredient, at different intervals, producing measurably different associations with health outcomes across populations of hundreds of thousands of people. This is the kind of precision the research is capable of, and the kind of precision that the usual health advice almost never delivers. Because telling you, eat eggs a few times a week, not every day, is a more nuanced message than either eggs are dangerous or eggs are fine. It doesn't fit a headline, but it fits the data. The reason this matters so much as an entry point to everything that follows in this video is that it establishes something about how your body actually works. It responds to patterns of repetition, not to single choices, not to occasional decisions, but to what you do with enough consistency that your cells, your hormones, your cardiovascular system, and your metabolic processes have time to register and respond. What research has measured in eggs, in nuts, in coffee, in the simple act of walking, reflects that. And when you understand what the patterns actually produce, the habits become much easier to maintain. Because they're no longer based on a rule someone told you to follow. They're based on a biological reality you can see clearly enough to trust. Think of your cardiovascular system as a river that's been running for 50 or 60 years. The water moves, the banks hold. But over decades, sediment accumulates, currents shift, and the places where the river bends begin to show wear that wasn't there at 30. Whether that wear accelerates or stabilizes depends almost entirely on what's feeding the river and how consistently. This is exactly the frame the researchers who study aging and mortality have come to use when they look at daily habits. Not, does this food cause disease in isolation, but what does this input, repeated across months and years, do to the rate of accumulation inside an aging cardiovascular system? The nut research answers that question with unusual clarity, and it does so specifically for people in the exact demographic this conversation is about. In 2024, researchers published a study in the journal Age and Aging drawing on data from the ASPRI longitudinal study, the same cohort that produced the egg data from the previous block. Nearly 10,000 adults, all age 70 and older, tracked for years. The question: does daily nut consumption make a measurable difference in meaningful health outcomes? Not just cholesterol numbers, but actual outcomes: death, dementia, and persistent physical disability. The finding? People who ate nuts daily had a 23% lower risk of experiencing that combined outcome compared to those who rarely or never ate them. 23%. In people over 70, across an outcome that includes dementia and disability, not just heart disease. That's not a modest association. In the world of epidemiology, that's a signal that warrants serious attention. A separate Harvard study, one of the largest nutrition cohorts ever assembled, followed more than 100,000 adults across nearly 30 years. The consistent finding across both men and women: eating a 1-ounce serving of nuts 7 or more times per week was associated with a 20% lower risk of death from any cause, with particularly pronounced reductions in deaths from heart disease, respiratory disease, and cancer. The mechanism researchers point to is layered. Nuts are among the most nutrient-dense whole foods available, dense in unsaturated fats that support vascular flexibility, in magnesium that helps regulate blood pressure, in arginine that supports nitric oxide production, which in turn keeps blood vessels dilated and responsive. A handful of mixed nuts isn't just calories. It's a delivery system for compounds that act directly on the vascular aging your cardiovascular system is undergoing every year, regardless of what you do. And here's the detail that makes nuts distinctive compared to almost every other food studied at this scale. The benefit was consistent, not conditional on the rest of the diet being pristine. Not dependent on other lifestyle factors aligning perfectly. People with lower overall diet quality still showed the association. People with higher body mass index still showed it. The signal held across subgroups in a way that most individual food associations don't. What your body is telling you through that data is something simple. Some inputs are so bioavailable, so directly usable by aging vascular tissue, that they produce measurable effects even against a backdrop of imperfect conditions. Daily nuts, sustained, are one of the clearest examples of that in the research. Not magic. Mechanism. And mechanism, sustained across thousands of days, is what the long-term data is measuring when it finds 20 and 23% differences in outcomes between people who do and people who don't. Here's a mistake that almost everyone makes, and it's subtle enough that most people never catch it. They treat healthy habits as equivalent. One walk is as good as another. One cup of coffee has the same effect regardless of when you drink it. One daily choice is interchangeable with any other daily choice, and the only variable that matters is whether you made it or didn't. The research on daily movement makes the problem with that assumption very clear. A 2025 study from Vanderbilt University examined the relationship between walking and mortality in a large adult population. The finding was not what most people expect. 15 minutes of brisk daily walking. Not an hour, not a structured exercise program, 15 minutes at a purposeful pace, was associated with a nearly 20% reduction in all-cause mortality. 20% from 15 minutes. But here's the detail that changes how you should read that number. The same study also tracked participants who walked slowly for significantly longer durations. In some cases, more than 3 hours per day of slow, low-intensity walking. Their mortality reduction, approximately 4%. Not statistically significant on its own. Intensity mattered more than duration. 15 purposeful minutes outperformed 3 slow hours. This is not what the standard advice, just get your 10,000 steps, take the stairs, park farther away, is calibrated to produce. It's also not what most people naturally do when they decide to be more active. They move more, in a general, low-intensity way, spread across a day that's otherwise largely sedentary. And the data suggests that approach captures a fraction of the mortality benefit that a shorter, more deliberate effort produces. The coffee research surfaces a different but related error. The assumption that the same habit produces the same benefit regardless of when you execute it. A Haynes cohort study tracking more than 40,000 adults found that 1 to 2 cups of coffee daily was associated with a 19% lower risk of all-cause mortality compared to non-drinkers. A robust finding that has appeared across multiple independent studies. But research published in the European Heart Journal added a dimension that almost no coffee coverage ever mentions. The timing of coffee consumption produced meaningfully different outcomes even when total daily intake was identical. Adults who concentrated their coffee intake in the morning, before noon, showed substantially better cardiovascular and all-cause mortality outcomes than those who drank the same amount spread into the afternoon and evening. The likely mechanism involves cortisol and adenosine cycling, the circadian clock's sensitivity to caffeine exposure in the later hours, and the downstream effects on sleep quality. Itself a major independent predictor of mortality. Coffee in the morning works with your body's existing rhythms. Coffee in the afternoon and evening works against them. The practical implication of both findings together is this. Many people are getting some version of these habits right. They walk, they drink coffee, but in a form that captures substantially less of the documented benefit than the research shows is available. Not because they're doing the wrong thing, because they're doing a version that hasn't been optimized by the thing the research is actually measuring, which is intensity and timing, not just frequency. Here is what the evidence actually recommends. Not as a set of rules to follow, but as a translation of what the research has specifically measured into practices that fit inside a real day. Nuts, 1 ounce, daily, without exception. 1 ounce is roughly a small handful. 20 almonds, 14 walnut halves, a small scoop of mixed nuts. That's the quantity that appears repeatedly across the studies that found the strongest associations. Not a meal, not a supplement. A handful, eaten daily, treating it the way you'd treat any medication you genuinely believed was reducing your risk of dying from heart disease by 20%, because that's approximately what the data says it's doing. The type matters less than the consistency. The Harvard cohort found benefits across multiple nut varieties: walnuts, peanuts, tree nuts of various kinds. The commonality isn't one specific compound. It's the profile of unsaturated fats, magnesium, and plant protein delivered in a daily, sustained pattern. Mix them. Rotate them. But don't miss them. Walking. 15 minutes, brisk pace, most days. Brisk means a pace where you can hold a conversation, but would rather not. Not a stroll. Not a warm-up. The Vanderbilt research defined it as moderate to vigorous intensity, the kind of pace where your heart rate elevates and stays elevated for the duration. 15 minutes of that outperformed hours of slower movement in the mortality data, which means that if your daily schedule has 15 minutes available and you've been telling yourself you need 45 to make it count, the research has a direct response to that. What amplifies this significantly, and what a separate NHANES analysis made clear, is total daily sitting time. Adults who sat more than 8 hours per day showed a 46% higher all-cause mortality risk compared to those sitting under 4 hours. And this held true even among people who exercised regularly. The walk doesn't erase the 8 hours. It's not a full offset. The most protective pattern in the data isn't exercising hard for a window and then sitting all day. It's moving deliberately and reducing the sitting that surrounds it. Coffee. 2 to 3 cups, finished before noon. The NHANES data found the strongest mortality association in the 1 to 2 cup range, with additional benefit extending to roughly 3 to 5 cups in other studies before the signal flattens or reverses. What matters more than hitting an exact number is the timing. The European Heart Journal research was specific. Morning coffee drinkers showed meaningfully better outcomes than afternoon and evening drinkers at equivalent total intake. 2 cups before noon delivers more of the documented benefit than 3 cups spread across the day. Eggs. Several times a week, not daily. The ASPRE data on eggs produced a clear signal. Weekly consumption was associated with lower cardiovascular and all-cause mortality. Daily consumption trended in a different direction. Not dramatically, and the difference wasn't statistically significant within the study, but the direction reversed. Across the broader body of egg research, including the Northwestern study's findings, the most defensible position based on the totality of evidence is moderate, regular consumption, 3 to 4 times per week, rather than making eggs the anchor of every daily breakfast. Together, these 4 habits don't require a new diet. They don't require a gym membership. They require a 1-ounce handful of nuts, 15 minutes of deliberate walking, 2 cups of coffee consumed before noon, and eggs eaten with some intentional spacing across the week. What makes them worth understanding in this level of detail is that each one has been measured at population scale in tens of thousands of people across years, and the outcomes associated with doing them correctly versus incorrectly represent meaningful differences in how long and how well the body functions. Here's the finding that reframes everything else in this video, and it's one that almost never appears in any summary of daily habit research. The NHANES data on sedentary behavior found that adults sitting more than 8 hours per day had a 46% higher all-cause mortality risk compared to adults sitting under 4 hours. That number alone would be striking. But what made the finding particularly significant was what the researchers controlled for. They accounted for exercise. The elevated risk held even among people who met standard physical activity recommendations, even among people who exercised. In other words, the walk you take doesn't fully protect you from the chair you return to. This isn't a reason to despair about sitting. Most adults in modern life sit for work, for commuting, for recovery. The question isn't whether you sit, but whether you understand what sitting at length does and what it doesn't. What the research suggests is that daily deliberate movement and daily prolonged sitting are not a zero-sum equation. They're two separate biological inputs producing two separate biological effects, and one doesn't cancel the other. Both need to be managed. The mechanism involves multiple systems. Prolonged sitting reduces activity in the large muscle groups of the legs and core, which are responsible for a significant portion of your body's glucose uptake and lipid clearance. When those muscles are inactive for extended periods, glucose accumulates in the bloodstream rather than being pulled into cells. Lipids circulate rather than being cleared. The vascular system, deprived of the mechanical stimulation that comes from muscle activity, begins to lose some of the flexibility that supports cardiovascular function. Inflammation markers rise. Blood pressure creeps up. And all of this happens not because you failed to exercise, but because the hours between exercise sessions haven't been interrupted. The practical translation of this is straightforward, though it requires a change in how you think about movement. It's not one 30-minute block surrounded by stillness. It's shorter, deliberate effort distributed differently. A 15-minute walk that produces 20% mortality reduction combined with intentional breaks in sitting every 60 to 90 minutes during the day. That combination, the research suggests, captures far more of the biological benefit than either one alone. Now, layer in the coffee timing finding from the previous block. Morning coffee works with your circadian rhythm rather than against it, supports wakefulness through adenosine suppression at the right point in the day, and doesn't compromise the sleep quality that makes the next day's movement feel accessible. Afternoon coffee does the opposite. It extends alertness into the evening, degrades sleep depth, and creates a cycle where fatigue the following day makes the 15-minute walk feel harder, the sitting feel more necessary, the morning feel less productive. The 4 habits in this video interact. They are not independent toggles. A nut-eating, brisk-walking, morning coffee person who sleeps 7 hours and sits thoughtfully throughout the day is experiencing a compounding effect that population research captures across decades. Remove one element, and the others lose some of their protection. Add one element without the others, and the ceiling for benefit is lower than the research was measuring. This is what the data is actually pointing at when it reports 20% mortality reductions and 23% reductions in combined outcomes. Not single habits in isolation, but patterns of daily behavior sustained across years, where each component makes the others more effective. The version of health that the research keeps finding at scale is not about perfection. It's about coherence. A coherent daily pattern, deliberate movement, the right food at the right frequency, stimulants timed well, sitting interrupted, is what produces outcomes that individual decisions made in isolation cannot. Robert is 71 years old and works with his hands 3 days a week. Not because he has to, but because he found in his mid-60s that the weeks he didn't move purposefully were measurably different from the weeks he did. Joints stiffer, sleep shallower, appetite off. He didn't read a study. He ran his own experiment on himself over 18 months and noticed the pattern before anyone named it for him. What the research did was give him a framework for what he was already observing. The Vanderbilt walking data confirmed that the 15 to 20 minutes he was spending each morning at a pace that made him breathe was doing more for his longevity trajectory than the 3 slow miles he'd been counting steps through the year before. The nut data confirmed that the small container of mixed nuts he kept in his car, a habit he'd developed in his late 50s, was producing effects he couldn't see, but that population data was measuring in people exactly like him. This is what the research is actually for. Not to make decisions for you, but to validate or correct what you're already doing based on something more reliable than how it feels in the moment. Most people will spend years adjusting their habits based on articles and advice that carries a fraction of the evidential weight of what was described in this video. They'll add a supplement that's never been studied in their demographic at the scale the nut data was. They'll walk in ways that feel virtuous but produce a fraction of the benefit that a shorter, more deliberate effort generates. They'll time their coffee based on preference rather than the circadian biology that explains why the same 2 cups, shifted 2 hours earlier, produces a meaningfully different outcome. Most people will never hear the distinction between weekly and daily egg consumption. Most people will never understand that the chair they sit in for 6 hours is doing something their morning run doesn't fully undo. Most people are making choices based on incomplete information, not because they don't care, but because nobody has sat with them long enough to explain what the data actually says. That's the reason this channel exists. If what you just heard made you want to keep going deeper, if this is the kind of explanation that actually changes what you do tomorrow morning, rather than what you vaguely intend to do someday, follow along. There's a great deal more ahead. Not opinion, not trends. The research itself, translated accurately at this level of detail every time. The picture is not complete yet, because everything described so far, the nuts, the walk, the coffee timing, the eggs, is about what you put in and what you do. But the research has one more layer that sits underneath all of it, connecting these 4 daily habits to something larger. What happens in your body, not just this week or this year, but across the entire remaining arc of how long you live and how much of that time you spend healthy, mobile, and clear-headed. That layer is what the closing block of this video is for. Go back to where this started. The fatigue that arrives on schedule every afternoon. The weight that settled in your 50s and stayed. The brain fog that interrupts the hours you need most. You were told to eat better, move more, cut the coffee. Advice that's not wrong exactly, but stripped of everything that would make it actionable. Stripped of the frequency, the timing, the intensity, the specific input that the research was measuring when it found 20% mortality reductions and 23% reductions in combined outcomes for people in your demographic. What this video has done is put the specificity back in. Not because specificity is interesting in itself, but because it's the difference between a habit you maintain and one you abandon. A person who understands that 15 brisk minutes outperforms 3 slow hours doesn't need willpower to choose the shorter, more purposeful walk. A person who knows that morning coffee is doing something physiologically different from afternoon coffee doesn't need to be told to change the timing. They change it because they understand what's happening inside their body that makes the difference real. This is what the research, at its best, produces. Not rules to follow, but mechanisms to understand. And mechanisms, once understood, tend to generate their own compliance because you're no longer following someone else's instruction. You're responding to something your own body is doing. The 4 habits in this video are not a protocol. They're not a 30-day challenge. They are daily inputs that the largest cohort studies in their respective categories have found to be associated with measurable differences in mortality, disease burden, and functional health across populations of people exactly like you, over 50, dealing with the accumulated wear of decades, trying to make sense of contradictory advice, hoping to find something that actually holds up when you look at it carefully. Nuts. Daily. Not because someone said they're a superfood, because nearly 10,000 adults over 70 were followed for years, and the ones who ate them daily were 23% less likely to die, develop dementia, or become physically disabled. 15 brisk minutes. Not because walking is generally good, because when the Vanderbilt team isolated intensity, the signal was there, specific, measurable, and large enough to justify changing how you think about what a walk means. Coffee before noon. Not because afternoon coffee is forbidden, because your circadian biology has a relationship with adenosine and cortisol that your timing either supports or disrupts. And the mortality data reflects which direction that disruption goes at the population level. Eggs several times a week, not every day. Not because eggs are dangerous or perfectly safe, because the frequency question, across multiple independent cohorts, produces a different answer than the binary good or bad framing that most egg coverage has ever offered. None of this is certain. Epidemiology is probabilistic, not deterministic. But the direction of the evidence is clear enough, and the habits themselves are straightforward enough that acting on this information costs nothing, and the research suggests the benefit compounds across every week you sustain it. If this conversation gave you something you'll actually use, not file away, but use starting tomorrow morning, share it with someone over 50 who's been circling the same contradictory advice for years. They deserve the specifics. Leave a comment with which of these 4 habits you're already doing and which one surprised you most. That's the kind of signal that tells this channel what to keep building toward. The daily choices compound. That's not a motivational line. It's what the data keeps finding at every scale, in every cohort. Start with the handful of nuts. Everything else gets easier from there. This video is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for medical advice. Always consult a healthcare professional.